Please don't let them take my dog. Those were the words that stopped an entire biker bar cold. The kind of place where no one asks for help and no one expects mercy. But just hours earlier, 84-year-old Margaret Ellis had been sitting alone in her dim, quiet home, unaware that her entire world was about to collapse. Not because of age, not because of illness, but because of a system that didn't care who she was or what she had already lost. Margaret had lived in that small, weathered house for over 50 years. It wasn't much: peeling paint, creaky floors, a roof that leaked every monsoon, but it held everything. Memories of her husband Daniel, who used to fix radios at the kitchen table, echoes of her son Peter, who would race through the hallway as a child before life took him too soon, and the quiet, lingering presence of a life that had once been full. Now, the house was silent, except for Daisy. Daisy, her golden retriever, was old too. Her fur no longer bright, her steps slower, her eyes a little cloudy. But to Margaret, she wasn't just a dot. She was the last heartbeat in a house that had nearly forgotten how to feel alive. Every morning, Daisy would rest her head on Margaret's knee while she drank her tea. Every night, she curled up beside her bed, as if guarding the only person she had left. They understood each other in a way no one else could. So when the first letter came, Margaret barely paid attention. Official envelopes had a way of sounding more urgent than they really were. But then came the second, stamped, bold, impossible to ignore. And then the third, delivered by hand. She remembered the knock clearly. 3 sharp raps on the door that echoed through the empty hallway. When she opened it, the man standing there didn't smile. He didn't greet her. He simply handed her a document and said, "Final notice. Property seizure due to unpaid taxes." Margaret blinked, confused, her hands trembling as she tried to make sense of the words. "There must be a mistake," she said softly. "I've lived here for decades. I've always managed." The man didn't respond with cruelty, just indifference. "You have 72 hours to vacate the premises," he said. "If not, enforcement will proceed." 72 hours. It didn't sound real. It couldn't be. She hadn't even realized how far behind she'd fallen. Medical bills, inflation, things piling up quietly until they became something unstoppable. Margaret didn't argue. She didn't shout. She just nodded slowly and closed the door, the paper still in her hand, as if letting it go would make it more real. She sat down in her chair, Daisy immediately resting her head on her lap, sensing the shift in the air. Margaret stroked her fur absent-mindedly, her mind racing, not about where she would go, not about what she would lose, but about one thing. Just one. Daisy. The answer came the next morning when she made a call. The county housing office. They spoke politely, efficiently, like people reading from a script. Yes, temporary accommodations could be arranged. Yes, assistance programs were available. Yes, transportation would be provided. Margaret listened carefully, nodding at every sentence, until she asked the only question that mattered. "Can I bring my dog?" There was a pause. Then the answer, "No, ma'am. Animals are not permitted in the facility." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "She's old," she said quietly. "She won't survive in a shelter. She needs me. I'm sorry." The voice replied, not sounding sorry at all. "Those are the rules." Rules. Margaret hung up slowly, her hand shaking as she set the receiver down. Daisy looked up at her, tail wagging gently, completely unaware of the decision that had just been made about her life. That's when Margaret felt it. That deep, crushing realization that she could lose everything and no one would stop it. Not the house. Not the memories. Not even the one living soul that had stayed by her side when everything else disappeared. She tried calling again. Another office. Another number. Different voices, same answer. No exceptions. No alternatives. By evening, the truth had settled in like a weight she couldn't lift. They weren't just taking her home. They were taking Daisy. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt something close to fear. Not for herself, but for the small, loyal creature who trusted her completely. She couldn't let that happen. She wouldn't. But what could she do? Who would listen to someone like her? She didn't have family to call. No friends left to turn to. The world had quietly moved on without her, and now it was finishing the job. She sat by the window as the sun dipped low, the orange light stretching across the room, illuminating dust particles that floated like forgotten time. Daisy lay beside her, her breathing slow and steady. Margaret reached down, placing her hand gently on Daisy's head, and whispered, "I won't let them take you." But even as she said it, she didn't know how she could keep that promise. Hours passed. The house grew darker. And then, somewhere deep inside her, something shifted. A memory. A conversation she had overheard months ago at the grocery store. Someone mentioning a group, bikers, rough men. People avoided them, whispered about them, said they were trouble, said they didn't follow rules. At the time, Margaret had dismissed it. But now, rules were exactly the problem. She looked down at Daisy again, then at the clock, then back at the door. It was a ridiculous idea, terrifying even, the kind of thing she would have never considered in any other life. But this wasn't any other life anymore. This was the last stand of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Slowly, carefully, Margaret stood up. Her joints ached, her balance unsteady, but her resolve was something else entirely. She reached for Daisy's leash, her hands no longer trembling the same way. Daisy perked up immediately, tail wagging, thinking it was just another evening walk. Margaret managed a small smile. "Come on, girl," she whispered. "We're going somewhere." She stepped outside, closing the door behind her, not knowing if she would ever open it again. The night air was cool, carrying the distant hum of engines and voices from a place she had never dared to approach. A place people warned others about. A place where someone like her didn't belong. But Margaret Ellis wasn't walking toward comfort. She wasn't walking toward safety. She was walking toward the only chance she had left. And as she made her way slowly down the dimly lit street, one hand gripping the leash, the other holding onto the last thread of hope she had, she whispered softly, more to herself than anything else, "Please, just don't let them take her." The moment Margaret Ellis stepped through the heavy wooden doors of that biker bar, she felt every eye in the room turn toward her at once. Conversations cut mid-sentence, laughter died instantly, and even the low hum of music seemed to fade into the background, as if the entire place itself was trying to understand what it was seeing, because nothing about this made sense. An 84-year-old woman, small, fragile, dressed in a faded cardigan, standing in the doorway of a place built on noise, toughness, and unspoken rules, with a trembling hand clutching the leash of an aging golden retriever who pressed nervously against her leg. For a second, no one moved, as if they were waiting for someone else to react first. But Margaret didn't step back, didn't apologize, didn't turn around, because she couldn't. Not anymore. Not when the only thing she had left in this world depended on what she did next. She took a slow step forward, then another, her shoes echoing softly against the wooden floor, and the deeper she walked in, the more the weight of the room seemed to close around her. Men in leather vests watching silently, some with arms crossed, others leaning back in their chairs, expressions unreadable, the kind of faces that had seen too much and trusted too little. Daisy stayed close, her tail low, sensing the tension, but she didn't bark, didn't pull away. She just stayed with Margaret, just like she always had, near the center of the room, at a large table surrounded by a few of the toughest-looking men there, except the one who clearly mattered most, the club president, Rex. A man whose presence alone seemed to hold the room together, gray beard thick against his chest, a deep scar cutting across his cheek, eyes sharp and steady as they locked on Margaret the moment she entered his line of sight. He didn't look surprised, not exactly. More like curious, like he was trying to figure out what kind of story would bring someone like her into a place like this. Margaret stopped a few feet from the table, her breath uneven, her fingers tightening slightly around Daisy's leash. Rex leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long second before finally speaking, his voice low but carrying across the silent room. "Ma'am, you lost?" And there it was, the question everyone was thinking, but Margaret shook her head slowly, because no, she wasn't lost, not anymore. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, fragile but real. "They're going to take my dog." And for a moment, nothing happened. No reaction, no interruption, just silence hanging thick in the air as the words settled into the room, as if they needed time to be understood. Rex didn't respond immediately, his gaze shifting briefly to Daisy, who looked back at him with those tired, trusting eyes, before returning to Margaret. "Who's they?" he asked, his tone calm but focused, and Margaret swallowed, her throat dry. "The county, they're taking my house. I didn't know I'd fallen behind. I tried to fix it, but I can't. They said I have to leave in 2 days." Her voice faltered, but she forced herself to continue, because this was the part that mattered, the part that had brought her here. "They said I can't take her with me. They said she'll have to go to a shelter." And that word, shelter, seemed to land differently, A few of the bikers shifting slightly in their seats, exchanging brief glances, because everyone in that room knew what that really meant for an old dog. Margaret's grip on the leash tightened as she looked down at Daisy, then back up again, her eyes now glistening with something she had been holding back all day. "She won't make it there," she whispered. "She's all I have. I don't have anyone else. I don't have money. I don't have family. I just—" Her voice broke, the words catching in her chest, but she didn't stop, because she couldn't. "I just need someone to help me, please." And then, finally, the words that cut through everything, soft but heavy enough to stop even the hardest man in that room from looking away. "Please don't let them take my dog." And that was it. That was the moment something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a current passing through the room. Because these weren't men who responded to authority or rules, or even sympathy in the way most people understood it. But they understood loyalty, they understood loss, and they understood what it meant when someone had nothing left except one thing they refused to let go of. One of the bikers at the table exhaled slowly, shaking his head under his breath. Another leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table as he looked at Daisy again. Really looked this time, seeing not just a dog, but what she represented. Rex, though, stayed still for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before he finally pushed his chair back and stood up, the sound loud in the quiet room. And as he stepped closer, Margaret instinctively tensed, but not out of fear, more out of the weight of the moment, because everything now depended on what he would say next. Instead of addressing her immediately, Rex crouched down in front of Daisy, holding out his hand slowly, giving her space, giving her a choice, and Daisy, after a brief hesitation, stepped forward just enough to sniff his fingers, her tail giving a small, uncertain wag, and Rex let out a faint breath, almost like a quiet acknowledgement, before gently scratching behind her ear. "How old is she?" he asked without looking up. 13, Margaret replied softly. "Her name's Daisy." Rex nodded once, as if filing that away, before finally standing back up to face Margaret again, his eyes different now. Not softer, exactly, but more certain, like he had already made up his mind about something. He looked at her for a long second, taking in the fear, the exhaustion, the quiet determination that had carried her all the way here. And then he asked the only question that mattered. "Where do you live?" Margaret blinked, almost caught off guard by how simple it sounded, as if he wasn't asking out of curiosity, but because he already intended to do something with the answer. "Maple Street. Number 17, she said, her voice steadier now, and Rex gave a short nod, turning slightly toward the rest of the room, his gaze sweeping across the man who had been watching this entire exchange unfold. "You heard her," he said, not loud, but firm enough that no one would mistake it for a suggestion. "We ride. In the morning." And just like that, the silence broke, not with chaos, not with noise, but with movement, chairs scraping lightly against the floor as a few men stood up, others reaching for their jackets, a quiet, coordinated shift that didn't need explanation because everyone already understood. Margaret stood there, still holding Daisy's leash, trying to process what had just happened, because she hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anything, really, but certainly not this immediate, unquestioned response. And for the first time since the letters had arrived, something inside her loosened just slightly, like a knot beginning to untangle. Rex turned back to her, his voice lower now, meant only for her to hear. "Go home," he said. "Stay there, don't sign anything, don't let anyone in." Margaret nodded quickly, her eyes filling again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was something else, something fragile but powerful. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely enough to hold what she meant, and Rex gave a small shake of his head, glancing once more at Daisy before stepping back. "Ain't done anything yet," he said simply, and as Margaret slowly turned to leave, Daisy walking close beside her, the door closing behind them with a soft creak. The room inside didn't return to what it had been before, because now it wasn't just a bar anymore. It was a place where something had been set in motion, something that would carry into the next morning, when engines would roar to life, and a group of men the world didn't understand would show up somewhere they were never expected, for a woman no one else had listened to, and a dog they had already decided wasn't going anywhere. By sunrise, the quiet street on Maple Street looked nothing like it ever had before, because long before the county truck could even turn the corner, the low rumble of engines had already rolled in, one by one at first, then in a steady line, until the entire road outside Margaret Ellis's small, weathered home was filled with motorcycles, their chrome catching the early light, their presence impossible to ignore. Neighbors peeked through curtains, unsure whether to be alarmed or curious, because this wasn't normal. Not here, not ever. And yet there they were, nearly 30 bikers standing or sitting beside their machines, not loud, not chaotic, just waiting. Margaret stood just inside her front door, hands trembling as she pulled the curtain back slightly. Daisy pressed against her leg, and for a moment, she couldn't fully process what she was seeing, because she had expected maybe one or two of them, maybe a gesture, maybe words, but not this, not an entire wall of people who had shown up before anything had even begun. And right there at the front gate, exactly where she could see him, stood Rex, arms crossed, his posture calm but unmovable, like he had already decided how this day was going to end. When he noticed the curtain shift, he gave a small nod, not a smile, not reassurance in the usual sense, but something steadier, something that said without words, "You're not alone anymore." Margaret swallowed hard, her grip tightening gently on Daisy's leash as she whispered, "They came. They really came." And for the first time in days, Daisy's tail wagged a little more freely, as if even she could feel the difference in the air. Minutes later, the county vehicle turned onto the street, a plain white truck followed by a smaller car, both slowing almost immediately as the drivers took in the scene ahead, because whatever they had expected, a quiet compliance, maybe a locked door, they had not expected this. The vehicles came to a stop a few houses down, doors opening. Cautiously, two officers stepping out with folders in hand, their expressions shifting from routine focus to something more uncertain as they looked at the line of bikers, at the house, at the situation that had suddenly become far more complicated than paperwork. One of them approached first, trying to maintain authority in his stride, though it was clear he was recalculating every step. "What is this?" he called out, his voice firm but lacking the edge it might have had on any other day, and Rex stepped forward just enough to meet him halfway. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just present in a way that made it clear he wasn't moving. "Morning," Rex said calmly, his tone almost polite. "You hear about the house?" The officer adjusted the papers in his hand, glancing briefly at his partner before responding. "This is a legal property seizure. We've given notice. The occupant has failed to vacate." And for a second, the tension in the air tightened, because those were the words that usually ended conversations, the kind backed by rules, by systems that didn't bend. But Rex didn't react the way most people would. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his vest and pulled out a thick folder, worn but organized, holding it out slightly. "You might want to take a look at this first," he said, and the officer hesitated, clearly not expecting any form of counter, but after a brief pause, he stepped forward and took the folder, flipping it open, his eyes scanning the pages, and as he read, something changed, subtle at first, a slight tightening of his jaw, then a slower pace in his movements as he went back over certain lines, double-checking, his partner stepping closer to look over his shoulder. Rex didn't interrupt, didn't rush them, just stood there quietly, giving the documents time to speak for themselves, because sometime during the night, while most of the world slept, someone had done the work. An old friend of the club, a lawyer who owed Rex more than one favor, had gone through every detail of Margaret's case, every notice, every deadline, every procedural step, and what they found wasn't dramatic, wasn't flashy, but it was enough. An error in filing, a missed legal window, a notice that had not been properly validated under current regulations. Small things, technical things, but in a system built on rules, those were the cracks that mattered. The officer finally closed the folder, exhaling slowly as he looked back up at Rex, his earlier certainty gone, replaced with something closer to reluctant acknowledgement. This needs to be reviewed," he said, his voice lower now, less commanding, and Rex gave a small nod, as if that was exactly what he had expected to hear. "Take your time," he replied, stepping slightly to the side, not in surrender, but in confidence, like someone who already knew the outcome. After a brief exchange between the officers, they turned back toward their vehicles, the tension in their movements replaced with hesitation, with the realization that this wasn't going to be resolved today, not the way they had planned. The truck never even started its engine again, and within minutes, both vehicles pulled away from the street, leaving behind nothing but the fading sound of tires on asphalt and a silence that felt entirely different from the one before. For a moment, no one moved, as if the entire scene needed a second to catch up to what had just happened. And then, slowly, almost carefully, Margaret opened her front door and stepped outside, Daisy at her side, her legs unsteady but carrying her forward anyway, because she needed to see it for herself, needed to stand there and know that it was real. Rex turned back toward her as she approached, the rest of the bikers remaining where they were, giving her space, giving the moment room to exist. And when Margaret reached the edge of the porch, her voice barely held together. "They are gone?" she asked, and Rex nodded once. "Simple, certain, for now, and probably for good," he said. And that was all it took. The weight of days, of fear, of helplessness finally breaking as Margaret sank slowly into the porch chair behind her, one hand covering her mouth as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Not quiet this time, not held back, but real and overwhelming. Daisy immediately climbing halfway into her lap despite her age, licking her face, her tail wagging in wide, relieved arcs as if she understood everything that had just been saved. "They didn't take her," Margaret whispered, almost in disbelief, her fingers curling gently into Daisy's fur. "They didn't take her." And Rex allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile, glancing down at the dog before looking back at Margaret. "Wasn't gonna happen," he said simply, like it had never been a question to begin with. But what happened next was what truly shocked everyone who heard about this story later. Because the bikers didn't leave, not after the trucks were gone, not after the immediate problem was solved. Instead, they stayed, some walking up to the house to inspect the broken fence, others checking the roof, one of them already on the phone arranging materials, because somewhere along the line, this had stopped being about stopping a seizure and had become something else entirely. Within hours, the yard was alive with quiet activity, repairs being made, old boards replaced, leaks patched, things Margaret hadn't had the strength or money to fix in years suddenly being handled like it was nothing, and she watched it all from her chair, Daisy beside her, still overwhelmed, still trying to understand how a group of strangers had turned into something more in less than a day. By the time the sun began to set, the house looked different. Not new, not perfect, but cared for again, like it had been given back its dignity along with its owner. And as the bikers finally began to gather near their motorcycles, preparing to leave, Margaret slowly stood once more, walking toward Rex with Daisy at her side, her steps steadier. Now, her voice still soft but no longer breaking. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, and Rex shook his head lightly, glancing around at the men who had made it happen before looking back at her. "You don't," he replied. "Just take care of her," nodding toward Daisy, and Margaret smiled through the last of her tears, her hand resting gently on Daisy's back. "I always will," she said. The engines roared to life one by one, the sound filling the street again, but this time it didn't feel intimidating. It felt like something else entirely, something protective, something that had shown up when it mattered and asked for nothing in return. And as they rode off, leaving Maple Street quieter than before, but forever changed, Margaret stood there on her porch, Daisy sitting faithfully at her feet, both of them watching until the last motorcycle disappeared from view, knowing that what had happened that day wasn't just about stopping loss. It was about proving that even in a world that can take everything from you, there are still people who will stand in front of it and say no.